I'm going to go ahead and get started. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. I actually just came off of a working group meeting, so it has been a busy day of moderation for myself. But for those of you who don't know me, my name is Nick Sorosky. I'm a senior manager for policy and advocacy with the Alliance for Peace Building. And I am so excited and honored to host today's webinar launching the Institute for Economics and Peace's Ecological Threat Report 2025, or the ETR. The ETR is a comprehensive, data-driven global assessment of ecological risks that cover 3,125 subnational areas in 172 countries and territories, and it represents more than 99% of the world's population. The report measures four interlocking threats: water risk, food insecurity, the impact of natural events, and demographic pressure. So this 2025 ETR is actually the first edition of the report that includes time series data. So it's covering changes between 2019 and 2024, and it gives a view into year-on-year volatility of ecological threats, many of which stand to be further impacted by climate change. I just want to say AFP is always happy to partner with IEP. They're a vital member and partner of ours. They're a crucial actor in building the evidence base for the peace building field so we can identify major peace and security trends, and more importantly, the interventions that are needed to address them. IEP publishes annual reports such as the Global Peace Index, the Global Terrorism Index, and the Positive Peace Index. I encourage all attendees here to explore IEP's website and read these seminal reports. So today's webinar is going to begin with an overview of the report's findings by Michael Collins. He's the America's Executive Director at IEP. We're then going to turn to a panel discussion where experts from a range of backgrounds are going to provide insights into global trends on water conflict and how the international community can support water cooperation for sustainable peace. Indeed, this year's ETR's main finding is that the unexpected and sometimes divergent relationships between water and conflict exist. On the one hand, the report finds that conflict death rates are 50% higher in places where water stress is rising due to heightened rainfall seasonality. On the other, the report highlights how there have been no interstate wars fought over water in the modern era. And in this way, the hundreds of active freshwater treaties around the world can demonstrate a strategic cooperation that's effective when the downside risks are well known, similar to nuclear non-proliferation treaties. So I'm now going to turn it over to Michael, who will guide us through an in-depth look at the report's findings. Michael, over to you.
That's excellent, Nick. Thank you very much. And of course, it's always wonderful to be able to do this in partnership and collaboration with Alliance for Peace Building. Thank you very much for coming, everyone. And Nick, you did a fantastic job of obviously describing the report in itself. We've been producing it for about 5 years now. Actually, this is, I believe, the 6th year, and it now forms part of one of our core reports. We're most known as an Institute for the Global Peace Index, which is a measure of peacefulness around the world, a variety of different metrics that Nick kindly referred to on resilience. And for a number of years now, we've been measuring that against ecological change. So that's what the Ecological Threat Report is essentially all about. Hold on a second here. There we are. And again, Nick, you gave a great sort of overview of some of the aspects of the report. Of course, all of this is kind of sort of built on the shoulders of giants in many ways. You'll see considerable endnotes and footnotes in the report. There's a considerable amount of academic research. In many ways, what we hope is that the Ecological Threat Report serves as a compendium, and then there is IEP analysis building on top of that to be able to do a bit more of a deep dive. Maybe starting, with kind of like the bottom line up front, right? Some of the key takeaways. In the report last year, and again this year, there's a considerable focus on water risk overall. Last year was very specific to irrigation, for example. And, one of the key reasons is that evidently it's connected with those four other indicators related to ecological threats that Nick kindly referred to. Of course, a deep intrinsical connection with food insecurity, but also natural disasters, right? So if we look at the trends in natural disasters, especially over recent years, 80% of natural disasters are, precipitation related, right? Be that floods, be that storms, or alternatively drought as well. And of course, intermingled with all of that are aspects of population stress or demographic growth as well, both in terms of consumption of water and the impact that those changes in water availability and precipitation have on human populations. A core aspect of the report this year is this kind of sort of focus on variability, right? Rather than scarcity. In fact, there's a number of countries that are very scarce in water, but don't actually see high levels of water risk, right? Because things have adapted essentially to that scarcity. So it is essentially that change of that and that unpredictability that the report really seeks to explore this year. Um, Nick kindly also noted that, historically, at least, this cooperation between countries has functioned extremely well to be able to deal with some of these aspects of managing water and ensuring water availability for everyone. But increasingly, especially over recent years, we are seeing an increasing amount of water-related conflict. Now, it's not the single driver, it's always a combination of things. And oftentimes it's already building on previous conflicts that exist. But nonetheless, it's kind of concerning that, at least for the last 5 or 6 years, we've actually seen how the amount of conflict is surpassing some of those acts of cooperation that we talked about before. And then largely, of course, the opportunity to continue with targeted investments focusing on building access to water and by extension, food security as well. So irrigation continues to be a core aspect within the report as well, but also new ways of being able to enhance existing cooperation agreements as well. So delving into the results straight away this year, this is a map that hopefully you are somewhat familiar with in this instance, denoting high and low levels of vulnerability. So this is overall ecological threat score, encompassing all of those indicators that were discussed prior. Again, food security, water stress, rapid population growth, and natural disasters. So sub-Saharan Africa continues to be the region most impacted by this. And, 9 out of 10 the top 10 countries most impacted are in sub-Saharan Africa. Niger, Burundi, which is around here, and Afghanistan are the three countries that are most impacted overall. This paints an okay picture and a valuable one, of course. But one of the things that we're able to do for the first time in the ecological threat report this year is to actually sort of look at levels of change throughout the world. So this is since 2019, which is kind of interesting because in some ways, especially related to food security, for example, it allows us to be able to also explore the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. Overall, since that time, 96 countries have deteriorated, and 74 countries have improved, right? So more countries have deteriorated or have developed higher levels of ecological threat. Overall, ecological threats globally have risen by 0.8%. So hopefully that, for those of us who are always yearning for additional data points to be able to point out how climate change is driving ecological change, as is human growth, hopefully this is just one more point of evidence there. There's a bit of nuance that needs to be unpacked here in a sense. So for example, in some cases, places with a very high risk have actually seen an improvement, right? Southern areas of Afghanistan, for example, right here. Other areas with moderate risk have seen deteriorations, specifically in South America. This big chunk that you see here in the middle is a Brazilian state called Mato Grosso. That was severely impacted by wildfires last year that have had a notable impact on ecological measures there. The area that has actually deteriorated the most since 2019 is actually here, this sort of north part of Africa and also coastal West Africa as well. So Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco are the most impacted. But it doesn't paint a full picture again because this is actually coming off a strange baseline. So back in 2019, it was actually going through an extremely abundant year with plenty of precipitation. So actually, it's that original benchmark that is slightly off compared to the global average. And the same can be said for Europe. So in the case of Europe, it was going through an extremely dry period back in 2019. So it shows up as an improvement here as well. So, there's kind of two things that we can do. Number one, take a step back and look at, okay, well, what are the meaningful changes per domain globally? And then the other thing that we can do is to sort of dive slightly further deep in to see what other nuances that we can do. And that's one of the things that the report has strived to do this year. So, taking that step back and looking at food insecurity around the world, this curve that you see here, this is from the Food Agriculture Organization, FAO. And it's actually found to nourish people, but it tracks quite well to the measures of food insecurity that we track in the ecological threat report. So over 300 people, 300, sorry, excuse me, million people became food insecure in the period from just before to just after the pandemic. The nice thing about this graph in particular is that it kind of sort of paints that within context, in the sense that, here we'd been seeing a distinct improvement over time in measures of food security around the world, drastically impacted by the pandemic. And now we've begun to see an overall recovery, but the expectation is that we're really not going to be back down to sort of those baselines for another 5 years at the very least. So, Southern America and Central America are actually the only two regions that generally improved in food security over that time. They weathered the COVID-19 pandemic relatively well. It does mask a couple of things. So, for example, in Colombia, and this was not related to COVID, but certainly due to the conflict there, food security saw a significant deterioration over that time. The two other countries, or the two other largest countries, the two other countries that deteriorated the most are Lebanon and Botswana over this particular time. The interesting thing about those two, and also Colombia to a degree, is that these are countries that don't really need, aren't really affected massively by population growth right now. So that is helpful if you look at other countries like Afghanistan or South Sudan, for example. Not only do they have, deteriorating food insecurity, but they also have rapid population growth as well as high levels of ecological threat. Um, Touching on population growth overall, sub-Saharan Africa, again, that, chunk of area that we saw at the very beginning, is expected to significantly grow in population still, which kind of sort of speaks obviously to water availability and food insecurity as well. Expected to grow about 70%, up until over the next 25 years, essentially. Now, we mentioned in the report that those projections have been revised downwards and are consistently revised downwards. So we may not reach that, but it is distinctly a consideration in countries with high levels of ecological threats and food insecurity. Some of the high income nations are actually facing different issues and will increasingly so. So this chart that you see here is actually looking at the people over 60 versus the people under 5. And as we can see, we're due to see a quite significant increase of older people in over the world globally, but primarily in advanced economies, many countries of which are already starting to be below the replacement ratio. So the key challenge here is actually going to be less environmental, in that it's going to have it's going to be a lot more socioeconomic, considerably more strain on, social security measures, for example, and a distinct lack of productivity, right, and available workforce in a lot of these countries. So the other indicator that we would like to touch on before delving a bit more into water risk specifically is the impact of natural events. So this is the indicator in the ecological threat report that has deteriorated the most by 2.8% over this particular period since 2019. Last year, saw records in temperature, records in displacement. But again, it's one of these things that kind of needs to be put in context as well. So as you can see, there's been a significant, I think we say in the report, a tenfold increase in the amount of natural disasters since 1980. And this graph would sort of would confirm that in many ways. But there's a bit of nuance there. So, number one, reporting has become significantly better, especially with the advent of a lot of the sort of the technological developments in the late 90s, early 2000s. So the number of disasters that are reported around the world has invariably significantly increased, potentially explaining a large amount of this increase here. Also, things like early warning systems and those being put in place and being able to be communicated as well. So if we look at, say, from this 2000 mark, we actually see that the number of natural events has kind of sort of remained relatively stable over that time. So this particular graph may not be the the smoking gun that we would like to see to be able to show how climate change is impacting humans, and of course how humans are impacting the environment as well. One of the things to note, perhaps, though, is again, how storms and floods and precipitation has a significant impact when it comes to its impact on humanity. Although I should say that we observe that the number of deaths from disaster has reduced significantly. So countries overall have become significantly better prepared than they have been, again, going back to the 1980s. So from memory, it's a 50-fold decrease in the amount of people that are dying in disasters currently around the world. So let's touch on water risk, which is going to be the final domain and perhaps where we do a tiny bit more of a deep dive here, and specifically in relation to rainfall continuity and conflict. For me personally, this is one of the most interesting charts this year. So this looks at changes in rainfall seasonality. What do we mean by seasonality? So, basically, it's the amount of water that falls within a particular period of a year. Some countries have one wet season or alternatively two wet seasons. The Philippines, Kenya are countries that have sort of two wet seasons, right? And let's say that you have a wet season that goes from, I don't know, March till June, and it's 3 months. An increase in seasonality means that now you're seeing most of that rain, most of the rain throughout the year in the month of March, for example, right? So this is looking at those changes over time, taking two patches from 2005 to 2010 and then 2020 to 2025. Now, this is over 5 years, which means that you no longer have those, annual changes that can create noise in some of the research. So in the report, we delve quite specifically into what's called the Karamoja cluster, which is down here, noting the existing measures of conflict and water stress that exist there. But as you can see, changes in seasonality are a lot more broad. Look at Algeria here, for example. This is Pakistan, Namibia, Botswana, South Africa, and of course, other countries around the world. So we've seen this 60% increase in overall rainfall seasonality over the past decade. So, this is a very, in my mind, distinct data point to be able to show how rainfall is changing and its implication for the way humans live and deal with it over time. And of course, the implications of this changing seasonality is going to be most severe in the places that already have significant water risks, such as sub-Saharan Africa, for example. One of the things that we delve into, obviously, as IEP and producing the Global Peace Index, we look into measures of conflict around the world, as well as peacefulness and resilience. So we're able to map very clearly these changes in seasonality compared to measures of conflict around the world. So, in places where seasonality is decreasing, in other words, water is becoming more spread out through the year, we see on average about 2.1 deaths per 100,000 people from conflict specifically. That goes all the way to 9.8 in the case of severe increases in seasonality. So almost a five-fold increase in the number of deaths when we see these increases in seasonality. Now, this stands as a global measure, as a global average. But as always, that nuance needs to be explored at the regional and the country level as well. And sometimes it doesn't map for individual countries or even regions. In the case of sub-Saharan Africa, we mentioned in the report that you don't really see that correlation until you actually bring in measures of population growth, for example. But nonetheless, it is a very important data point, and it does show how all four of these indicators interact to drive measures of conflict and peace. Here's a sort of a readout of overall measures of conflict specific to that Karamoja cluster, which incorporates Kenya and Uganda, and also parts of South Sudan, I believe. Now, the important thing to note here is that, conflict, especially pastoralist conflict, has existed in this area for quite some time. But within measures of conflict, it's been relatively peaceful. So there are a number of geopolitical components there that are changing the nature of conflict, including the availability of arms, for example. But seasonality is playing a significant role. So the likes of UNDP and IOM are doing amazing work analyzing some of the impact and tackling some of these core drivers. As and when seasonality is changing, as and when herds are moving either earlier in the year or alternatively using different paths, we see that as a distinct early warning system for conflict because we see conflict arise from it. So the tracking of the seasonality and the underlying resilience metrics can be very important for peace building more broadly. We touched on pastoralism in the case of the Karamoja cluster, but maybe just to sort of, point to the distinct connection again between water and food. So, 70% of water consumption is primarily dedicated to agriculture and hence and food, of course. And of course, this percentage is distinctly higher in lower middle income and low income countries. So as seasonality increases, we expect to see differences or differentiations in food security, providing some of these things aren't controlled. Now, a traditional way of being able to manage this in many ways is irrigation. And one of the things that we pointed out in the report last year is that in sub-Saharan Africa specifically, some of the places that have the largest water risk have the lowest instances of irrigation around the world. So, 80% of cropland essentially around the world is non-irrigated. Only 2% of cropland is irrigated in sub-Saharan Africa. So that's a challenge, of course, noting all of the stuff that we talked about before, but it's also a distinct opportunity. In the report last year, we noted how for about 6% of its overall water resources, in sub-Saharan Africa, there are almost 40 million hectares of cropland that could be irrigated, drastically reducing food insecurity in the country. Now, as always, the devil is in the detail there, right, in terms of how these things are implemented. So, in closing, I just wanted to touch on another thing that the report focuses on, which is overall levels of cooperation in terms of water management. So there are lots of, basins, water basins around the world, in particular to rivers and lakes, that drastically affect water availability. So over 40% of the population is actually, reliant on some of these major water basins around the world. The good news is that, for the most part, these have all worked very, very well. There's been over 700, almost 700 of them, going back to the 1800s. And they've been very successful with relatively low instances of conflict around the world. But of course, that is starting to change, suggesting that some of these water agreements start to be under stress. If you look, for example, right over here, and you take the total value from, say, 2011, 2012 until now, the number of conflict, water-related conflicts is actually outpacing some of those cooperations that we see as well. So that's a distinct concern there. There's a number of distinct, lessons, positive lessons that can be learned. In many occasions, these water agreements serve not only to be able to manage water, but serve as the basis for dialogue and for increased trade between countries. So we give the example of the Niger Basin, for example, being a great basis for subsequent relations between, nine West African countries in particular, and a lot of stuff that can be built on that. I think that largely ends the presentation. Maybe just to touch on a couple of final things. Again, with this understanding that, increasingly some of this cooperation is perhaps insufficient or needs to be buttressed, and the importance of looking at this perhaps through a peace building lens. We often talk about positive peace as a framework to be able to ensure that any contributions that are made, be it through irrigation, be it through enhanced cooperation agreements, can be done so in a way that doesn't generate conflict. And that inherently has been the case in the development sector. Be it small scale irrigation, be it very large scale cooperation agreements, or even very large scale investments, the peace building lens continues to be absolutely critical. So I just wanted to point again in closing to the value of organizations like the Alliance for Peace Building to be able to not only ensure that we're focusing on, managing and mediating conflict proper, but of course focusing on a lot of the progressive drivers of either improvements in peacefulness or alternatively partial drivers of conflict, as is water risk. So I'll leave it there. and look forward to hearing from our other presenters today.
Wonderful, Michael. Thank you so much for that in-depth overview. I've seen you do it almost a dozen times at this point with so many different reports, and every time you do a wonderful job. So thank you so much. Just wanted to echo my comment in the chat from at the beginning of the event. If you have any questions for Michael, do feel free to drop your questions in the chat. We will have an open Q&A segment later on, and we will be compiling questions to ask to Michael as well as to our panelists. So now I'm excited to move over to the panel discussion segment of the event. So I'm going to invite Regina M. Pelos, who's an international criminal law attorney, to turn on her camera and join us. Thank you so much for joining us today, Regina. We have a wonderful collection of panelists today. After Regina, we're going to hear from Mohammed Khalifa, who's a regional researcher working on integrated modeling and assessment at the International Water Management Institute. We're also going to hear from Laura Turley, who is a senior science policy manager at the Geneva Water Hub. Regina, I am going to kind of begin this conversation by asking, and let me just spotlight you on the screen so everybody can see you. Wonderful. There we go. Your kind of background and your expertise is really on issues of water cooperation versus water conflict, especially from the perspective of international law and the involvement of grassroots and indigenous actors. So we just saw kind of a very compelling presentation from Michael on what are the global trends, right, on this nexus. So I'd love to ask you, what are the global trends that you have encountered in the last year on this nexus? And how do the report's findings align with your own observation as an expert working in this space?
So thank you, Nick, and thank you. It's great to see such a great turnout and audience for this, many of you with such diverse backgrounds. I put in the chat a link to the organization called the Congress of Nations and States, where a lot of the indigenous groups are working. It's kind of one that they lead. And so what I will say is, starting off with the report, I think is excellent in giving a very large overview as to multiple nexuses. I'm not a scientist, so for me, sometimes the charts are a little bit overwhelming, but I think it's not surprising to see that the top three areas that are facing ecological threats are Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and the MENA region. And it's also, I thought, very good to see that for the most part, the water sharing agreements work. But one of the things that I think kind of where I would come from with this perspective is that these reports a lot generally this one and then a lot of times the other way that we measure how this is working is really a state to state framework. And so what I would invite everyone to think about, especially in this space when we talk about water cooperation and conflicts, is really looking at it from multidimensional perspectives, in the sense that if we look at indigenous peoples, and I know there's multiple different names, whether they're tribes, ethnic minority groups, I'm just going to call them peoples to kind of capture everyone there. When we think about them in the presence of these issues, sometimes we're seeing that they're being sidelined or that their voices are not being included. So among the big three threats that I would say exist, if we look at it from perspectives that are coming from those communities, number one, the report definitely talks about climate change, which I think is obviously one that's impacting every species on Earth, not just humans. And I think the report does a really good job of explaining how this links together with water and food insecurity. The second threat that people's face is about land rights, and that really has come in multiple forms. So whether it's conflict, whether it's forced displacement as a result of conservation projects, protecting one specific species of wildlife and asking these peoples to move off of their lands that they've traditionally held for long periods of time, decades, and in some cases for just continuous history with the land, or forced displacement as a result of carbon projects or green energy projects like hydropower dams. And so these kind of threats to land rights impacts issues of water access and food insecurity for peoples around the world. And we see a lot of that happening everywhere. And so we can go into specifics in a minute on different cases. And then the third threat that I would say people face is threats to their traditional ecological knowledge or traditional knowledge systems, which are uniquely tied to the places where they have traditional footholds or strong homes. And so a lot of the language gets lost, knowledge gets lost, and then we have a problem with understanding where they may have been able to successfully cooperate on water issues or store water, or even have different avenues of protecting water sources that we won't have. So we have these kinds of threats that I think generally are facing, but I think complement the findings of the report in many ways if we look at it from the perspective of peoples. You're on mute, Nick.
Thank you.
Okay.
I think I would know that. No, thank you so much, Regina. That was a terrific kind of first crack at kind of the overview of what you're seeing on this nexus. So I want to maybe dive in a bit, right? And ask you if there are any particular context or case studies where you see this issue really front and center, really driving potential instability. But I don't want to be just negative. Obviously there are many negative impacts we're seeing from when it comes to these ecological threats, but also maybe context or case studies where these indigenous peoples are really contributing to innovative ways to promote water cooperation and to avoid water conflict and promote human security. So I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
So I think some of the examples, and it's really more one of the challenges that exist around, I think a lot of the methods that Indigenous peoples are using is that there is a lack of documentation and a lack of knowledge as to what is happening. And this was actually something that UNESCO noted in 2023 ahead of the UN Water Conference, is that we don't know a lot of what we should know. But in terms of kind of innovative, kind of being able to keep the ways in which they have been, storing water cooperation. We see some really great examples coming out of Papua, where, they still have the mechanisms that they've always traditionally used. And these are being documented as really great ways in which people are, successfully using water. In terms of examples where there are some areas where we need to look at very closely, I know that within Iran in different regions, there have been calls for using older tools and technology that once existed, but have been replaced by the state's, necessity or wanting to use different types of newer technologies. And so a lot of people now are asking for, can we go back to the way that we had done things to protect our water sources? And just recently, Iran has been in the news regarding the fact that they're even contemplating having to move their capital because of water shortages, and it's not because of conflict. So sometimes this is not because of conflict; it's just because climate change or whatever other kind of situations are driving this. And then within Africa, we see what's happening to the Maasai. Being kind of evicted from or and displaced from their lands for carbon credits or for this game safari that people want to build there. These are kinds of case studies that I think we can delve more deeply into to figure out what's going to happen to their water access. We see this also with tribes within India, the Bodo, which within Assam being evicted from their lands for tiger reserves. So the question there becomes, when these people are displaced, what is their water access? And then, of course, what can we do about it? But I think there are examples, but unfortunately, the documentation and the knowledge of that is really not something a lot of people, I think, in the international community write about or know. But we do know there's rain harvesting, a lot of technology, traditional technology using bamboo to collect water and different things like that do happen in these other communities.
Wonderful, Regina. Thank you. Really hammering home the importance of locally led
Mhm.
cooperation mechanisms, which, they are there. And it's important to surface that knowledge. So my last question to you is kind of, looking, scaling this to looking at the international community. What does the international community need to do to support issues at this intersection of water stress and indigenous peoples, right? What types of funding can be provided, other types of support? Would love to hear your thoughts on that.
So that I think is a really great question, Nick, because one of the key word I think here is inclusion. And I think a lot of people sometimes think this is, you know, we don't want to, there's some kind of giving up of something if we include people. There really isn't, right? It's really more about cooperation and sharing. And so we already have, you know, that kind of doctrine, free, prior, and informed consent that exists, especially when we're talking about land rights and we're talking about these other things. But inclusion actually can help. So we know along the Mekong River, you know, a lot of times Indigenous women are excluded from conversations, or if they have locally led projects, governments will say, no, we want our project to take priority over this one. And I think the inclusion of Indigenous people really can make such a huge difference in a lot of these projects. So I would love to see, you know, your organization and the one that wrote this report, all these organizations to get together and to really kind of support this kind of research and documentation on what are the kinds of projects that, you know, Indigenous people want to lead on, and what kind of mechanisms they have used for water, that maybe tools that we should be considering instead of these kind of bigger projects, and figuring out how we can include them more and making them front and center in this other kind of dynamic model that I'm talking about, is looking at it from a totally different perspective and seeing where we can innovate and work together, more importantly, to resolve some of these issues.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And you touched on something that I promise I want to circle back during the Q&A segment when you talked about the involvement of women Indigenous actors. I already saw a question in the chat focused on kind of the gender disaggregation of these trends. But a round of applause for Regina. We'll be hearing from her soon again later in the event. I'm so excited to now invite Mohammed Khalifa with the International Water Management Institute to come on screen. Let me just spotlight you. Awesome. There you are, Mohammed. Thank you so much for joining us today. And it is wonderful to be speaking with you. And now we're going to kind of look at this question from the perspective of research, right? Obviously, this product we're talking about today is a culmination of very comprehensive research. And your position at IWMI focuses on research as well. You have a really rich background doing research at the intersection of the water, food, and climate nexus, and looking at climate impacts and adaptation. So I would like to ask you, from the perspective of a researcher, do the findings of this report align with those of your research portfolio? And maybe specifically, what part of the report's findings were in line with your expectations, not much of a surprise, but were there any parts of the report that were surprising to you? I would love to hear your kind of thoughts on that. So over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Nick. Hello, everyone. And let me begin by congratulating the team on the launch of the Ecological Threat Report 2025. It's a timely and very valuable contribution. And yes, the overall direction of the report aligns closely with our research at the International Water Management Institute, IMI, and with what we observe on the water food climate nexus, especially in fragile and conflict affected regions. The report clearly shows how climate change is increasing pressure on water and food systems, especially in places where livelihood depend heavily on rainfall. This matches what we see in the Middle East, North and Sub-Saharan Africa, and South Asia, in countries like Ethiopia, Jordan, Morocco, and Pakistan, where drought and flood cycles are tightening and the time for recovery is shrinking. What I found especially important in the report is its subnational lens. So vulnerability is highly local, and we often see one irrigation scheme, for example, or one river basin facing severe stress while a neighboring area remains relatively stable. So the attention to local patterns of risk rather than national averages is critical. And water insecurity is not experienced evenly. And effective responses need to be grounded in the places where impact are felt. The report also speaks to something I see strongly in my research, there is significant untapped potential to substantially increase food production, especially through irrigation. Michael already highlighted this. And according to the 2025 Ecological Threat Report, the sub-Saharan Africa irrigates less than 2% of its cultivated land. And yet, irrigated agriculture is twice as productive as rain-fed agriculture. And the report knows roughly about 34 million hectares that could be irrigated using less than 6% of renewable water resources in that region. And that represents a major opportunity to improve local and global food security and climate resilience. If irrigation expansion is done efficiently and in ways that fit local water availability, sustainability, and management capacity. Another dimension that resonated with me is the emphasis in the report on how water insecurity interacting across scales. So water scarcity is first felt at the household or community level, a dry well, a failed crop, a longer walk to collect water. But these local stresses accumulate and can shape national development outcomes through rising food prices, pressure on services, and livelihood disruption. And in shared basins, these pressures can also influence cross-border dynamics. And this aligns closely with our research. As I mentioned, water crisis begin locally, but their impacts can grow to become systematic, which means strengthening resilience must start at the local scale, where adaptation decisions are made every day. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mohammed, for those reflections. And I think you teased out even more of the findings, right, from the perspective of a researcher. Researched, where is the evidence base very solid? What are the biggest takeaways? What are the biggest evidence gaps, right, in terms of interventions around water conflict and fragility that work, and where do we need more evidence?
Yes, I think the report's treatment of conflict trends mirror what I observe in some of my research. And based on the report, water-related conflicts are increasing, particularly in areas like MENA region, but they are significantly of local nature between neighboring communities, between farmers and pastoralists, or over small scale water infrastructure. At the same time, cross-border water conflicts has generally declined, where basin institutions and agreements are in place. And this is an important point that is often overlooked. Shared waters tend to encourage cooperation more often than conflict when there is a space for dialogue and negotiations. And I think that is a key takeaway. Yes, water can be a stress multiplier, but it can also serve as a platform for cooperation and shared benefits when the right governance arrangements are in place. I think one area that needs more research is at the local level. And here I would like to echo what Regina highlighted earlier, is that we know where water stress is happening, but we still have limited understanding of how people actually manage water day to day conflicts and management, especially when institutions are weak or disrupted. And in many fragile regions, there are local water committees, customary allocation rules, tribal agreements, and informal negotiations that organize access to water and solve conflict. And these systems are often adaptive and effective. even if they do not appear in formal policy documents. So the research need is to better document and understand these systems, and importantly, to learn how to strengthen them. And the question is how we link local practices with national planning and financing in a way that keeps them flexible and respected.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mohammed, for your remarks. Sincere appreciation. Giving you a round of applause. And we'll hear from you again soon during the question and answer segment. So I'm now excited to call on Dr. Laura Turley to join. And we have some discussion questions for her as well. And I will, Dr. Turley, just spotlight you so everybody can see you. There we go. I love your Zoom background, by the way. So you're kind of rounding out this panel discussion segment, but I would love to hear your thoughts. Being at the Geneva Water Hub, how are you seeing water stress interact with governance issues, especially as it relates to potential future conflict, emerging conflict, or existing conflict?
Yeah, thank you very much, Nick. And I also want to congratulate the authors for this report. I think it's really tricky to capture the nuance of the topic, and I think the report's done it really well, striking that balance between some high-level takeaway messages and data, but not shying away from the very complex relationship ultimately between humans and natural systems and water. Absolutely. So just wanted to start with that. To your question about kind of water stress and its interaction with governance, and then what we can do about it. I mean, I think from our perspective, we see, I mean, and we often hear this kind of piece about water crisis being a governance crisis. And I think what's important here is that when we see water stress, we see it often expose pre-existing governance issues. So probably things that were already maybe exposing some societal inequities. So I can give some examples. So, you know, which neighborhoods or which households are or are not connected already to a reliable supply. How are our water allocation permits done? Maybe kind of on a larger scale, thinking about different agreements or contracts that may be large businesses. I don't know, it could be anything from mining to agriculture. You know, how are their water rights protected during water stress versus a local communities? So, you know, there are ways to anticipate by looking at kind of current governance systems, really, and sort of thinking, okay, well, where are the vulnerabilities here, and how can we anticipate better? So in terms of preventing future conflict, I mean, I think one thing that's really inspiring that came out in the report is that we do see that there is a lot of experience in places that have traditionally, historically lived with water stress for cooperation. And so one thing to say is we probably have a lot to learn from those places, and we need to continue unearthing what those experiences are in terms of community structures, in terms of even infrastructural techniques, traditional water harvesting techniques, whatever it might be. I think we continue to need to learn from places that have long lived experience with water stress. And then maybe an overall kind of suggestion is that, of course, the more proactive governance systems can be rather than reactive, we're going to be better faced and in a better position to avoid conflict. So maybe to mention a couple of things, this can be in different sectors of the economy, and it has to be because water touches so many sectors. So cities that are preparing, if they're in, you know, stressful and water stress systems, that they're preparing for eventual kind of day zero scenarios. What does that look like? How do we align water storage and policies and allocation to anticipate that? In agriculture, it can look like the previous speakers and Mohammed mentioned, investing in irrigation. That also came up through the report. not necessarily a one size fits all approach to irrigation, but in many cases that can help avoid the impacts of water stress. And again, different sectors, hydropower operations, hydropower maybe can't function the same way in all sorts of seasons and in all sorts of years. So thinking cross-sectorally in a kind of in a proactive way. And then also to say, if we're thinking about transboundary water issues, meaning between different countries, this is a fair bit of the work at Geneva Water Hub. And here, the way to be proactive rather than reactive is to put in place in advance the principles or the rules that you'll use in advance. What kind of principles of sharing, what kind of provisions are there for extremes, floods and droughts, and other kind of more procedural ways that the countries want to manage it or resolve conflict and whatnot. So those tend to work well, but as it was also mentioned in the introductory presentation, a lot of these agreements need to be updated too. So those are some initial thoughts there.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Turley, for those initial thoughts. So, I feel like when we talk about water cooperation, it's common to think about rural spaces, especially as water connects to agriculture, right? But I'm curious to hear how you see this issue play out in urban spaces where you have increased population density. And specifically, following up on that, what are some promising approaches and programs that you've seen play out in urban areas to promote water cooperation and to promote water security?
Yeah, thanks. So again, we've seen in the report overall, and we know most water is used in agriculture, but that doesn't mean that water stress for cities is not a real and growing issue. One statistic that I use in my research is that by 2050, 2/3 of the human population will live in cities, and 1 billion urban dwellers will be in water-stressed cities. And I think we tend to think a lot about the impacts of drought in agriculture, which are very significant in real cities. For cities, drought is dramatic for water supply, but also for urban businesses that rely on that as well. So it has, I think, much more deeply rooted and kind of slow burning issues in urban spaces, drought and water stress, that is. And of course, what we're talking about is water supply for the majority of the world's population. If we're an urbanized world, this is not mundane. So, yeah, a couple of thoughts. In the past, I had done some work on this topic, and also from a governance perspective again, because governance approaches that really kind of put the city and its demand in the context of the bigger basin, and in the context, because most cities don't have water supply to meet their needs within the local vicinity. They're needing to import water from rural spaces or desalinate or think creatively. So it's really about urban spaces becoming a good partner in basins or in regions, or however the water governance system works. And from there, it's really, there's no miracles, there's different approaches. You need to manage the demand. There have been some cities in Europe, notably in Spain, that have really been successful and through knowledge and awareness raising, really reducing demand. In terms of new supply, something I really appreciated in the report was the focus on water storage, because without that, if we think about water storage on a per capita basis, I mean, the differences between the sort of developed and developing world are still significant. And again, it doesn't have to be one size fits all, the mega dams of the past, but there's a lot of ways to use integrated storage systems that bring together different, more diverse portfolios of water storage, in addition to large infrastructure as well. And then being creative in the ways that cities can reallocate, water from one use to another, compensating through finance, but also maybe using alternative, non-conventional water sources. There's some interesting research out there on that as well.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Turley. Yeah, you're invoking a lot of the kind of cities for peace work I see in the peace building field, and really
Mm.
looking at cities as crucial actors and kind of focal points, right, for building infrastructures for conflict prevention and promoting stability. So thank you. And now I'm excited to invite all of my panelists to turn their cameras on, if you would do so. And let me just add all of you to the spotlight. We're gonna do a little Brady Bunch. And Michael as well, please turn your camera on if you could.
I can't seem to, Nick. It says I can't start the video because it's disabled. There we are. Great. Thank
Just
you.
ask the server. Yeah, but there you go. All right, let
I'm
me add
back.
you
I'm
as
back.
well. Okay, wonderful. Okay, so now we're returning to the Q&A segment of the event. So everybody, if you have not, do feel free to drop questions and comments in the chat. I will pose them to the speakers. I've seen a few come through. Michael, maybe the first for you, we had a question on, is the data in the report, is it disaggregated by gender, especially as it relates to conflict? It could be not, but as a follow-up question, I want to maybe pose kind of to all of our panelists who would like to answer is, can you, explain this nexus as it relates to the impact on women and girls and gender, both in terms of how people are impacted, but then also what are the solutions to making sure these segments of the community are part of the solution and are involved in promoting stability for the benefit of all. So Michael, and then over to the other panelists.
Yeah, sure. So no, the specific metrics in the ETR, the ones related to conflict deaths primarily come from ACLED, which doesn't disaggregate by gender. I mean, from the research, most of the direct perpetrators and victims during conflict are men, essentially. But what women do suffer for is essentially the knock-on effects on that, and sort of, with regards to rape, with regards to household harlots, with regards to household burdens, for example, are disproportionately affected as well. I mean, in a lot of instances and a lot of places around the world that are affected either by food security or water risk, what you have is you have sort of essentially the men departing to be able to work in other countries, to be able to work in other places, sending home a remittance, and in this instance, the women kind of sort of supporting and managing the household from there. So it is distinctly different impacts. Again, we're limited in this instance to tracking it against conflict deaths. But of course, one can and should extend that to include broader measures of violence, some of the ones that I described before.
Thank you so much, Michael. Any thoughts from our three panelists on this question? Maybe Regina, I'm going to call on you. Just
Mohammed
'cause.
has his name raised, his
Oh,
hand raised.
I'm
Yeah.
so sorry, Mohammed first. Yes, Mohammed, then we can go to Regina. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Nick. Thank you so much. This is a very important question, and I will bring the experience that we are having here at EMI during implementation of research for development. We are an NGO that works in research, but for development, which is a bit different from the role of academia. So usually when we try to bring our solutions to local context, first we consult the communities. For example, if we would like to deploy a digital solution, a dashboard, or a digital twin, as we do now in Ethiopia in some refugee camps, we first consult the communities to understand their needs, their demands, and to take their perspective in that solution. And I think this is something very important, not only to make the solution work, but also for the ownership of the solution and the sustainability of such solutions.
Thank you so much, Mohammed, for that. Regina or Dr. Turley, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think I would just, go back to kind of emphasize the point that I made. I think there's an invisibility sometimes, especially within the indigenous communities, a double invisibility. They're invisible because they are sometimes because they are indigenous people and we don't know really what's going on because of the relationships with the governments. But then on top of that, women within those communities too the efforts that they're making and kind of the things that they can achieve, and being kind of the leaders of these households in many ways of and the matriarchs of their communities. We kind of need to know more. And so I think it's important for us to kind of think about how we can work and document what's going on, and more importantly, just work to understand what are the problems that they're facing in a specific way. And I think that's important too, because I think by region, the challenges are going to be different. So if we're looking at a context like Myanmar, that's going to be very different from, some places within sub-Saharan Africa.
Thank you so much, Regina. Dr. Shirley, if you'd like to offer reflection, the floor is yours, or we can move on to another question.
I think it was really well covered
Awesome.
by
Okay,
colleagues.
great. So I saw a question come through from Joseph Songo, who is a longstanding member within AFP's network. But he said, as a Congolese activist, storyteller, and community organizer, I have two short questions. One is, to what extent does the data in this report take into account the specific characteristics of the Congo Basin's ecosystems? How can this data be translated into local action? I would pose that question to Michael maybe, but in case any of the other panelists are familiar with the region and its dynamics, if you have any thoughts on how those findings could translate into local action. And then the second was on to the report. Does it break down or discuss advocacy measures to ensure African countries in particular don't pay the price for green transitions that may be imposed from the outside, especially looking at the link between climate justice and social equity? I think, the DRC is a very important example in that regard, just due to the extraction and mining of critical minerals, many of which are necessary for a green transition, which is important. But at the same time, if this is not done in an ethical, sustainable way, it can very much drive conflict, instability, violence in these communities, and you have to come at it from a conflict-sensitive approach. So maybe Michael, I'll let you go, and then I'll share other thoughts from this panelist. Michael, your microphone is off, just so you know.
Thanks, Nick. The Congo Basin is interesting because it's kind of sort of like essentially one of the largest waterways in the world. It obviously covers DRC, but also Congo, like Rwanda, Burundi, parts of Zambia as well, right? Um, the interesting thing about the DRC in particular, which is kind of sort of central to it, is that instances of irrigation there, for example, are extremely, extremely low, much lower than the sub-Saharan Africa, Africa percentage there. But that particular sort of area also gets a considerable amount of rainfall. So although a lot of the crops are unirrigated and there's a lot of untapped potential, well, there isn't currently a massive amount of need for irrigation, given the fact that there is significant rainfall. Now, so that is kind of like a contextual difference, perhaps, between some of the other places around the world. But as we see these increases in seasonality, obviously that is going to change. So it is going to become significantly more important. On the other question, sorry, Nick, a very quick reminder. What was it?
On the green transition and how
Yeah.
it can, yes, go.
So yeah, look, I completely agree. No, I don't think that anyone should pay for that. I mean, one of the things that we habitually hear from a lot of up and coming countries is no. I mean, look, we're more than delighted to participate in a just transition. We're more than delighted to to find more renewable forms of energy ourselves, so we don't become a sort of a fossilized industry country. But where we need help is investments in research and development, right? Foreign direct investment. We need all of these particular kinds of things. So no, absolutely not. I don't think that these countries should pay the price in the least.
Thank you very much, Michael. Open up the floor to our panelists if you have thoughts on that. Yeah, Regina.
One thing I do want to mention is I think another thing that sometimes gets neglected is when these mining operations are happening, especially in places like the DRC. I mean, you're talking about contamination in the water supply. People can't even drink the water. The air is polluted. I mean, there's so much other environmental impacts to this kind of stuff that's happening. So I don't really know. And I know that the University of Dundee has a just transition hub that's working on a scholarship that'll be coming out soon, but I don't really know what just transition really means anymore, and who it's just for. So I think it's something we have to think about, but I think particularly in these cases where the mining is going on, we have to think about the contamination to the water supply as a huge issue that needs to be addressed, especially if we're gonna, if we're gonna be mining in these areas.
Thank you, Regina. Mohammed, Dr. Turley, any thoughts?
Not particularly in this region, but maybe from other contexts where climate mitigation efforts are faced by trade-offs of securing food security. So in order to maintain and also to increase production, sometimes we are expanding horizontally the agricultural land. And you know that in the Congo Basin, there is one of the largest forests that are very important for climate change mitigation. And we are seeing this in different places where there is deforestation and also clearing of natural vegetation in order to expand into agriculture. And this creates some trade-offs between our efforts to mitigate climate change and our effort to enhance food security. And there are many interactions, unlimited, and also we cannot quantify them يعني, in a very good way because the interactions are complex and also unlimited. We need tools in these cases and tools, data that can help us anticipate risk and also act before crises happen.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. Yeah,
Just
so I
quick,
had, oh yeah,
just a
go ahead,
quick,
Dr. Phil.
no, just on, I mean, on mining, I think, it's one of the tools that's being used, and it's not particularly, it's not ideal, but it's better than nothing, or a lot of the voluntary instruments, voluntary standards, and that often have, a water component and a water and community component. But kind of, I think another area that will be seeing more potential for water and community conflict is in data centers as well. I think that's kind of an up and coming space, and we haven't really appreciated, I think, that there's probably something to learn from other water intensive industries, and to start anticipating essentially and preparing ourselves for that as well. In Africa and Asia, I mean, most of the data at the moment is coming out from conflict already emerging in the United States. There's kind of a bit of a data gap for other places. But yeah, something we're looking into as well at the Geneva Water Hub.
Yeah, that's a really important thing. I mean, we see it happening here in the US, the amount of water, the amount of electricity that these data centers consume and the impacts they have. I mean, I can tell you as somebody who lives in Virginia, my utility bill has gone up in part because Virginia is home to an increasing number of data centers. Um, so one question that came in from Denise, she was interested on thoughts from the panelists and Michael as well, um, on concerns when it comes to kind of like social issues and social impacts, such as impacts on mental health and well-being, and how that relates to water risk and conflict. This is obviously this nexus that we're talking about has many primary, secondary, tertiary impacts. I just saw this morning come through my email. There was a new study that said that people who live in conflict zones actually have increased risk of heart disease because of the chronic stress of living in a conflict affected or fragile context, right? So we see this play out in many different ways. But this mental health angle, I think, is really interesting. There's this growing consensus within the peace building field, which AFP convenes, that it is essential to sustainable peace. So not just for populations impacted by conflict, but also for those who are actually doing the peace building, right? Like local peace builders, local ecological activists or actors face enormous stress. And it's really important that we support their mental health and well-being so that the work can continue, right? So I open it up to all panelists if you have any thoughts on this comment.
Can just start us off by just saying, I mean, looking at it from the angle of water for peace, cooperation, stability. Um, we've done a literature review and a systematic review of the literature, and we really tried to understand, well, what kind of relationship do certain water interventions, maybe wash interventions, et cetera, have on peace and stability. And I think one of the first categories that really was clear, I mean, and it's just so obvious, but it was really, yeah, health and well-being, including mental health. And then this is particularly in a post-conflict situation, to have the establishment or the reestablishment of water and sanitation systems, is one of the most basic and important ways to ensure stability, reduce protests, and support civilians, in this context. So this came out quite clearly in our work, and yeah, it has just very far-reaching consequences.
Thank you, Dr. Shirley. Mohammed, Regina, any thoughts? Okay, awesome. Well, we've hit the 75-minute mark, so maybe we can call it there. But I want to let's first end before we end, do it with a huge round of thank yous. So first, thank you to Michael Collins. Thank you for the Institute for Economics and Peace for your report. It's so important in our day-to-day work. It helps us capture the big picture and the small picture. It's really crucial. So thank you for all your work. It's always a pleasure, Michael, working with you to plan these events. I want to extend a huge thank you to our panelists who came together, have been incredible sports, working to put this event together. They came, formed at a very quick timeline. I was connected to all of you through, my colleagues who they offer great recommendations of who are the best people that I can have speak to this issue that the report is focusing on, and I can agree and confirm that my colleagues were right. It was thank you so much for your work and for your expertise, and I do hope that we can continue working together in some capacity, maybe at future events too. And then my final thank you is everybody who attended today. I know it's busy. I know we have people who are attending deep into the evening their times. So very grateful for your time when you should be relaxing and thinking about something that is not wonky and technical like this. But it is a very important conversation. We were recording the event, so it will be uploaded to AFP's YouTube channel. So stay tuned for that. If you have any questions, you can always reach out to AFP. But again, thank you so much, and I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of their day. Bye.